Hello and welcome to our webcast. I'm Amy Pendergrass with Moss Adams, and I'm going to get us started for today's session, Navigate the New Tariff Landscape with Confidence. We're pleased that you've joined us today, and now I'm going to play our housekeeping video.
Welcome and thanks for joining us. Moss Adams webcasts are designed to help elevate your business performance. Transform your future for the better with advisory solutions tailored to your vision and supported by our collective technical resources. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
All right, it sounds like someone had some feedback, so apologies on that. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Torre Hammer, a partner and national practice leader for our manufacturing and consumer products team here at Moss Adams. Torre?
Yeah, thanks, Amy, and Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the current and potential future state of tariffs. Obviously, it's a very hot topic, and we have a lot of folks signed up for this webcast, and I'm really excited for our discussion today. As Amy said, my name is Torre Hammer. I'm a partner here at Moss Adams. We're a large regional accounting and consulting firm with 30-plus offices across the country. We're industry-focused, and this webinar is being hosted by our Manufacturing and Consumer Products Industry Group. Now, I'd like to introduce some great friends we have here with us today. First, we have Erik Smithweiss. Erik is an attorney at GDLSK, and he specializes in customs and related trade matters, representing clients before all major agencies that regulate international trade. We also have Tom Gumpert. Tom is CFO of Safe Boats International. Safe Boats is a 100% employee-owned and leading supplier of purpose-built, well-crafted aluminum boats designed for first responders, military, government, commercial, and private use. Safe Boats are trusted by state and federal agencies and municipalities, large and small, and can be found in use all over the world. We also have Ryan Martin. Ryan is the CEO of Yakima Products. Yakima is, of course, the premier manufacturer of vehicle roof racks and cargo management products that are sold throughout the world. And finally, we have our moderator for today's discussion, Justin Eckley. Justin's a tax partner at Moss Adams, and he specializes in the manufacturing and consumer product space. And with that, Justin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Torre. And again, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining this webcast. There's been a ton of interest around this topic. Throughout our firm, we've heard from numerous clients, and obviously there have been a lot of articles in the paper written about Trump's agenda. And with the inauguration 5 days away, we'll soon see how aggressive he's going to be and what he can actually get accomplished. But we do know that tariffs were a big part of his strategy during his first term, and he appears to be doubling down on that, or at least trying to give the sense that he will. As we know, sometimes these are just negotiation tactics, but it's best to be prepared and try and plan ahead. We expect that, each of you are probably coming to this webcast with different perspectives, different experience levels around the tariff landscape. And I think that's a good thing. Our goal here is that you would gain some useful information about the current state of tariffs, maybe some ideas as far as planning going forward, but even more so just to hear from other executives who have been navigating these issues with their companies. So Erik's going to kick off the meeting with some discussion around a current state of the tariff landscape, what has occurred since Trump's first term, some stuff that Biden has left in place or even expanded upon, and then possibly his view of the horizon, which, no one has a crystal ball, so it would just be his thoughts. But then we'll turn to a panel discussion with Tom and Ryan and Erik, just to talk through a few prepared questions just about their business and how they view the changes in potential tariff landscape, but also how they navigated, changes the last time around. And then we've also set aside some time for Q&A at the end. So please feel free to type in questions throughout the presentation. We'll be monitoring those, and we'll do our best to get them addressed at the end. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Erik.
Okay. Thanks, Justin. Appreciate that very much. To borrow from an old quote that Yogi Berra made famous, I feel like it's deja vu all over again, except this time slightly different. When the Trump administration first came into office in 2016, folks were very concerned, and we did a lot of that analysis on what tools the president might use to implement tariffs, and we felt like somebody in the Trump administration got our memo and decided that that was a good idea. But in any event, this go-round is going to be a little bit different because of the past history. So I know we have a slide deck. It's not that there's anything critical on it, but if you want to put that up on the screen, we can just kind of walk through a couple pointers. The idea is I just want to sort of make sure folks understand what the current lay of the land is and what really are some of the possibilities that are certainly within the realm of possibility, and then talk a little bit briefly about some mitigation strategies. Okay, I'm not seeing the presentation, but is it up right now?
Yes, it's up.
Yeah, Erik, it is up.
Okay. How do I see it while it's up there? Sorry to belabor these minor points here. Is there a button I would hit to see it?
It's possibly just minimized.
Okay. Well, it's not that important
For you.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how to do it on this thing. In any event,
Erik, it's on the original 301 tariffs slide.
Yep. Yeah, that's what I think. So the original tariffs were imposed under a law, Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, which provides for investigations to remedy, we'll just say, unfair trading practices. And if you want to go to the next slide, that will kind of show you how this thing was implemented. It was done sort of in 4 stages, which some folks call tranches. And up on the screen, you'll see the original one went into effect on July 6th. There was another group on August 23rd. What we call List 3 came out in September. And you'll see it kind of gives you a general description of the types of products. The first 2 are ones that were really focused on the types of products that the Trump administration felt were the areas where China was engaged in malicious practices related to IP theft and things of that nature. The number 3 was really a retaliatory tariff because China imposed tariffs on U.S. goods. We then got to a List 4, and List 4 actually got broken into 2 groups. And I think it is important for people to know this. There is this List 4A, and those are all goods which currently have a 7.5% extra duty. So this is extra on top of whatever is the regular duty rate. And that's where you're going to find most apparel and footwear products are at a 7.5%. Sort of miscellaneous food products tend to, well, some are at 7.5% and some are at 25%. So it actually it's split there. But there is a List 4B. And the list 4B, the list exists with the possibility of duties being imposed, but they never were. And so, that is certainly one area where if the Trump administration were to move quickly, they would simply impose the duties that are currently already on that list 4B. And it's available and anyone can take a look at it. You can find it at the USTR website. You can, if you're really good at using the tariff, you can find it in there as well. So that's kind of where things are today. There are a small group of products that are not subject to any tariffs at all that had to do with the way these things rolled out back in 2018. Again, those are ones where I suppose the Trump administration could quickly impose tariffs on those as well. So these all got rolled out under the Trump administration's first term. They continued without really much change under the Biden-Harris administration. And if you want to go to the next slide, you can see there were some new ones that have been implemented recently. So electric vehicles now have a very high tariff on them. This, of course, these are all products coming from China. You've got materials used in making solar cells. We still have some exclusions, some exemptions from the tariff for COVID-related items, and we have exclusions for certain machinery that's going to be used in manufacturing in the United States. There had been a period of where companies could get exclusions because a system was set up to permit exclusions to be requested. But many of those have expired and they have not been renewed. And it remains to be seen whether there will be a renewal of an exclusion process under the new Trump administration. The next slide covers what we call Section 232 tariffs. It's a different law. It's a national security related law. Different type of investigation, different presidential powers. But ultimately, this is where the Trump administration imposed a 25% tariff on steel products and a 10% on aluminum products. This generally has to do with steel that is being imported in sort of primary form, like sheet, plates, tubes, things of that nature. There are some derivative products that are subject to tariff, like bumpers for automobiles and nails and things of that nature. But generally speaking, finished goods and consumer goods would not be subject to these tariffs. Okay. These 25% tariffs are continuing. There are some exemptions, like Mexico and Canada and Australia are excluded for now. Europe has a quota allotment. There are some rules on how that works, but folks should generally know that these are here because it could be that we're going to have future investigations of this nature. So let's go to the next slide and take a look at what we've been hearing about proposals from President-elect Trump. Now, again, crystal balls that are reliable are hard to come by. If they're from China, the duty's at least 25% on those anyhow. So, what we have on the screen here is sort of what we have dissected from various press releases, media accounts, and things of that nature. But we have heard of President Trump wanting to impose, increased tariffs on goods, not just from China, but from all countries, somewhere in that 10 to 20% range. He's talked a lot about setting tariffs to 60% ad valorem from China. This concept of reciprocal tariffs is, Trump saying if another country imposes duties on our products, we'll hit them with the equivalent amount of duty. He's commented about imposing tariffs on countries that do not use the dollar as their reserve currency. He's mentioned the 25% on Canada and Mexico, which got a lot of attention in the media a couple of weeks ago. And he's talked about, much higher tariffs on vehicles being made in Mexico. Not sure, what that would all be about, but presumably the idea is that, Chinese entities are building factories and wanting to ensure that the U.S. automotive manufacturing base is not threatened by that. As far as, whether this is all going to happen and what the timing would be, if we went to the next slide, we put some notes on here just about sort of what the time frame to implementation might be. And I have to caution everybody that, what the law says and what the Trump administration will do will not necessarily be aligned. So, if President Trump really wants to move on a tariff, he may not wait for congressional action. So up here are the statutes on the left-hand side, which would be the tools that the Trump administration as the executive branch could use. A lot of folks are not aware of this, but under the Constitution, the power to impose tariffs rests with Congress and not with the president. So, unless Congress has authorized the president to act in a particular manner, the president has no authority to impose tariffs on foreign goods. What you see on the screen is sort of the authorities that Congress has previously granted presidents of the United States, but only under their very specific circumstances. The first one was the Section 301. That requires an entire investigation to go beyond the current one. So they'd have to do a new investigation to go beyond China, but if it's China, the ability to modify that and roll out new tariffs is there. And, in our view, it requires at least notice and comment, a minimum of 30 days advance notice. Whether or not the Trump administration would adhere to that remains to be seen. But in our view, that certainly is a minimum time frame to do a modification. To go beyond that and to reach other countries would require a new investigation, and that's going to take some time. And we'll be looking at a minimum of 3 months for that to get completed. The national security tariffs, if President Trump is just going to modify the existing steel and aluminum tariffs, that can be done on short notice. If it's going to hit other products, it does require an entire investigation, and it is a lengthy process of at least 6 months to go through that process. Okay. There is another section, 201. This does require a relatively long process. It's pursuant to international rules, and the U.S. statute there is pretty clear about how those investigations get conducted. There is this section 122 for balance of payments. This is one place where the president does have authority to impose tariffs, but just for a limited period of time, and it could happen overnight. It could go up to 15% for a maximum of 150 days. And so that authority already exists. It has been used before. President Nixon did it back in the 70s. And then there's this kind of catch-all statute, this International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Again, in my view, it is not written in a manner that would authorize tariffs, but it doesn't explicitly preclude it either. The important thing is that this would give the president the authority. All the president has to do is declare a national emergency, which shouldn't be a small matter, but there is the authority to declare an emergency and then impose whatever measures are needed, almost immediately. For context, this International Emergency Economic Powers Act is the law by which the executive branch imposes sanctions on bad actors around the world and things of that nature. The OFAC sanctions, all these things that we know about having to prevent the transfer of funds from Iran, North Korea, and all these various bad actors. The banks are all familiar with it. That's all under this statute. It's not written in a way, in my view, that would authorize tariffs, but it doesn't necessarily preclude it. And most of the pundits predict if the president really wanted to move immediately, he might try to invoke this law. I'm sure there would be some challenges, but that's how it would go. Lastly, we can talk quickly about, I think the mitigation strategies. I think folks need to prepare for the possibility that tariffs could come very quickly. And I think the Mexico-Canada thing is going to go away. I think that that's a negotiating tool. It would have a lot of adverse economic consequences to a lot of businesses in the United States to impose tariffs on goods coming up from Canada and Mexico. There's a massive amount of cross-border trade with processing operations on both sides. The mitigation strategies, the biggest and simplest one is changing country of origin. Folks use phrases like friendshoring, which I guess is moving production to a friendly country. Nearshoring means getting it closer to the United States, like, Canada or Mexico. Reshoring is actually bringing production back into the United States. The bottom line is this. If there was right now we've had tariffs on China for 6 to 7 years already. right? So the concept here is you would take goods that had been produced in China, you would move production to another country. There was a massive shift in production in Southeast Asia, out of China into Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia. And the concept here is that any inputs from China would have to be substantially transformed into a new article in this new country in order to qualify as not being a product of China. I will caution everybody that this is not a simple matter. And there are many folks who are getting caught up in this. And just because they go visit a factory doesn't mean that the factory is compliant, isn't getting the main, sub-assembly from China. So you need to be very cautious in this area. But if implemented successfully, that can basically eliminate the imposition of tariffs. If there's a higher rate on China, and there will be, getting it from Thailand or Vietnam will eliminate it, provided that the substantial transformation test is met. The concept of tariff engineering is that if different tariff codes have variable rates of duty, you can make a product that would fall into the code that has the lower rate of duty. In the China tariffs, we do have products that are 25%, and we do have some that are 7.5%. And as a consequence, there can be a significant financial advantage to getting a product reclassified into the lower rate of duty. Sometimes that's simply a matter of evaluating it and maybe getting a ruling or a decision from customs. Other times it may require actually modifying the product to make sure that it has the characteristics that would allow it to fall into the tariff code with the lower duty rate. Third, I put down here lowering the value of the goods. So these tariffs are all based upon, for the most part, ad valorem rates of duty, which means it's based on the value. So if the value can be reduced, then the amount of duties being paid can be reduced a lot. Our firm spends an awful lot of time, on all three of these, but as well as customs valuation. It does require some work. There are some opportunities. There's this concept called first sale. We're not going to do a session on that this morning, but it is an opportunity to create a lower basis of valuation. There's ways of deconstructing the transfer price among related companies and stripping certain cost elements out and having them be compensated for differently through a different sourcing structure. There are some complications, if done correctly, can save a significant amount of money. I mean, if your duty rate is 25 to 35% and you can eliminate 20% of the value of the goods, you can eliminate a substantial duty cost. There's also a tremendous amount of risks actually in all of these strategies, because if you get it wrong, the potential penalties can be quite significant. The last one I put up here was this exclusion process. So, that remains to be seen whether that will get implemented again. I mean, all we can do is wait and see. At the moment, there is no opportunity to go in and request exclusions on products. They did do it back in 2018 and 19. We're just going to have to be in a wait and see. So that's kind of the lay of the land. I can't tell you what the tariff amounts are going to be and when they're going to happen. My prediction, though, is that the Canada-Mexico thing is not going to happen. Okay.
Thanks, Erik.
You got it, Justin.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I one thing that you mentioned that I think was of interest to me is specifically around the differing processes that the Trump administration can try and use to enact tariff changes. We've heard a lot about his proposed tax cuts and how he's going to pay for those. Tariffs being one of those mechanisms, and we've heard and seen the news this concept of reconciliation in order to get some of these tax cuts through the door. However, my understanding is in order for tariffs to actually be counted in that process, they have to be created through legislation, and it's not necessarily just an executive order that he can make and still sort of take credit in the reconciliation for tariff revenue. Can you elaborate on that, or the likelihood of him trying to pursue one path or the other, and specifically how it may relate to the timeline for any tariff changes?
Sure. I have to preface this by saying I am not an expert on the legislative process or the reconciliation process in particular. and how budgets have to be reconciled. But there is this general concept that if you cut a tax, you have to make it up somewhere else. The fact that it would need to be a congressional provision that increases tariffs in order for it to count in the budget would not surprise me, because ultimately it is Congress that has the authority to impose tariffs, and these temporary measures imposed by the president are just that. So that's not surprising. I don't know what the appetite is on Capitol Hill to actually legislate higher tariffs. It's not wildly popular among, because it is a tax that does get passed on to consumers ultimately. As everybody on this call knows, notwithstanding what the president says, China doesn't pay the duties. The importers of record into the United States do. So, more than that, I can't really tell you. I would say the likelihood of Congress moving fast on a tariff bill that imposes duties is low, because they can't do anything quickly except beat up on China.
Yeah. Okay. Appreciate that. Yeah. Thank you.
You got it. There was a comment I noticed about, and I didn't mention this Section 321 de minimis as a strategy for mitigating duties, and I might just want to take 1 minute to mention that. So there is a law that allows goods that are under $800 in value, if imported by one person on one day, to come into the United States without payment of duties, and it also exempts the tariffs imposed under Section 301. It has been a strategy that has been very successful for a number of companies, and basically you have to do your to-consumer distribution, out of a facility in Mexico or Canada. There are some folks who've been able to figure out how to fulfill Amazon in doing this program, but the idea is that the goods coming in consigned to one person on one day have to be under $800 in value. So some foreign sellers ship goods to themselves in small increments to the United States to come into Amazon, or companies do fulfillment out of Mexico or Canada. It takes work to implement it. There are costs. So it really does require an evaluation of the duty savings relative to the higher costs of trying to operate in DC from those locations. We also don't know what changes are coming down the road. There's been a lot of talk about Congress, lowering the threshold back down to $200, and it would be Congress that would have to do that. There's been the Biden administration proposed eliminating eligibility for any goods subject to these 301 tariffs. That would be a massive burden on folks that are using this to avoid the 301 tariffs. That proposal has not gone forward yet, but could be forthcoming.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. Let's get Tom and Ryan going. Really appreciate you both being here. If you'd like, as we sort of get started on these questions, feel free to share a little insight into your businesses. Try and keep it sort of topic related. Where do you do manufacturing? What types of products do you import, raw materials, et cetera? Maybe customer base, sensitivity to pricing, things like that. But Tom, let's get started with you on this first question. Describe the impact or implications to your business from the last round of tariffs when Trump took office the first time.
So actually the first time around, we were primarily affected by the aluminum price increases. So we build boats out of aluminum plate. A lot of it is sourced in U.S., but our suppliers, it's a fairly homogeneous part. So we did see an impact on price increases there. Almost all of our contracts are fixed price, whether it's federal government or state and local governments, those sorts of things. So we can't really react with our customers. We can't go back and ask for increases. It's very difficult. And so we did find that profitability was impacted pretty hard in those years. I think since then we've taken some steps to do some repricing and things that help us mitigate that going forward. But at the time, the strategies were pretty limited.
Thanks. And you mentioned, there were some negative impacts on profitability. Did it impact growth or trajectory of the business in any way, or?
Probably not to a great extent, because our contract to delivery sort of timeline can be anywhere from several months to up to a year. So we probably already had those contracts, those sales were made. As we move forward, we have to be obviously conscious of what's going to happen now because it's going to impact the future. But I think at that time it was the contracts were in hand already.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Ryan, how about for you?
Yeah, it was pretty impactful to our business. Our footprint at the time was about 80% of our COGS from China, 20% from the U.S. So our footprint at the time, again, was one manufacturing facility in China and one in California. So of 80% of our COGS hitting, 25% tariff, it was pretty impactful. So it was both a profitability impact, also just simple, dollars lost for reinvestment strategies that we had to grow the business. So I would say unit sales suffered quite a bit. We did try and recover, but our product, being a consumer product, is really kind of market price driven. So it's not cost plus. So we really, and we can't pass on 100% of that. And that's given just in our kind of industry and how we play, and our competition doesn't necessarily have the same sourcing model. So our main competitor pulls quite a bit of product from Eastern Europe, which wasn't necessarily impacted by the duties. So we had to be cognizant of that. So I would just say that the first round was significant. We have put some things in place we can talk about later, and what Erik mentioned, and some of the mitigation strategies that we have put in place since the 2018 tariffs.
Okay. Thank you. And Erik, you mentioned in your slides, some of the common mitigation strategies, country of origin changes, tariff engineering. You gave some sort of high level stuff on that. Can you elaborate on any of those, or maybe what are common things you would go to a new company that's sort of engaging you? What would you look at first, and how would you help them sort of work through the process?
Sure. So what typically happens is a company that's been sourcing a product from China will look for alternative suppliers. And depending on their product, there's more or less flexibility depending on the product. I mean, if you need UL certification, you can't just run to a plant in another country and start making the product. There's an approval process you have to go through. So, it does depend in part whether there's other regulatory or approval requirements that are needed. But in a nutshell, what we would do is if a company that was building a product in China wants to build it, let's just say in Thailand, we would recommend that we take a look at, start with the bill of materials, what goes into this product and where are those components coming from. And I mean, this is a process where we do quite a bit. What we're really looking for is to identify the critical components that may be coming from China so that we can do an evaluation to determine if our friends in U.S. Customs would agree that the manufacturing in the second country would be enough to create a substantial transformation of the product. If you take consumer electronic products, I mean, you get different rulings potentially for different articles, but where the main board of a consumer electronic product is manufactured and populated with semiconductors and capacitors and resistors and other components is typically going to end up being the country of origin of the product. So if you take example like something as simple as car chargers or wall chargers, client wanted to move production to I think Vietnam, and after some work back and forth, we explained to them that they can't make the board in China. You can't make all the components in China and just ship them to Vietnam and assemble it and expect Vietnam to be the country of origin. It's not that simple. And so with some back and forth, they figured out how they could get bare boards out of China, get the various components to populate the board and undertake that board manufacturing assembly, in Vietnam, and then assemble on the rest of the components. And we got a ruling from Customs that was favorable. There's plenty of other scenarios that are just like that. So it all really depends. A lot of folks went to Mexico, but I have to caution everybody that although there's a free trade agreement with Mexico, qualifying under the free trade agreement is not an automatic green light on the China tariffs. They get analyzed separately. It's a process, and there's a lot of things we look at. There's no automatic value-added tests. You hear a lot about that in the trade community, and that is not the case for the United States. It's this kind of esoteric concept of substantial transformation.
Thank you. Yeah. Ryan, Tom, maybe a question back to you. You mentioned sort of what business implications were the first time around when these tariffs were first implemented, some challenges, and how you referenced some strategies that have changed. Business conditions are not necessarily the same as they were back then, but how have you altered your strategy going forward with respect to, tariffs that were already implemented and sort of thoughts around, what may be coming? Ryan, maybe I'll start with that.
Sure, I can jump in. So, like I mentioned, 80% of our COGS from China in 2018. So since then, we do have, we actually invested in another facility in 2017 in China. So we have 2 in China now. Had we known that, we probably would have otherwise made some different decisions. But we also have a facility in Taiwan that previously is under the same ownership. So we're vertically integrated, but hadn't made our category before. It was making another product in the group. So we, and as Erik mentioned, it's a tough thing to do. So you have to really, make sure that you substantially transform the product. So it's understanding, does that, tier 1, tier 2 supply chain exist in that country? What are, you got quality impacts, right? You got safety impacts, you got lead times. So it's really just was a big landed cost study for us. And by moving it, so now we're about 40% out of China, 40% out of Taiwan, and 20% out of the U.S. from our COGS perspective. We've moved quite a bit into Taiwan, building up the infrastructure to support that. And that's kind of where our footprint is today. And we've invested in powder coating. We've invested in new machinery and also growing the supply base to support that. The cost is higher, so you obviously have to evaluate that. Skill sets are different as well, but we feel good about where we are today. Now, if we continue down this path and China goes to 60, Taiwan may go to 10 or 20, both of those changes, would triple our tariff impact today. So we would continue probably to move more production into Taiwan. We also are investing in a facility in Thailand as well. The other thing we did in the first go around, and we'll likely do again, is we've increased our 3PL capacity by about 15 to 20% to bring products in ahead of when the tariffs would hit. So hopefully we have some time to do that as well, and we'll be utilizing that to bring more product in ahead of the change.
Hey, Ryan, we're getting a number of audience questions around something you just touched on, just around supplier and supply chain diversification. It sounds like you moved some of that to Taiwan recently. I'm wondering if you could just touch on how that process went. What were some of the challenges in that move?
Yeah, I mean, because we were already, our parent company is actually headquartered in Taiwan. It's a little bit easier for us, I think. It wasn't just some new venture, but the supply base took some effort to get on board. So, and we still have probably 10 open programs that we're continually to move more production to Taiwan, just to leverage the work we've already done. But for example, aluminum extrusions. I mean, we went through, I think, 4 to 5 different suppliers before we selected the right supplier. So it's a big effort, an engineering effort, of course, for our product. But we're just at the beginning of that exercise for Thailand. We won't be probably pulling product from Thailand for another 16 months, but that is a little bit newer for us. We don't have as much familiarity with that country, but the things we learned and are continuing to learn on transferring the substantial transformation of goods from China to Taiwan. It's obviously you have to if you're staring at 60% tariffs from China. I mean, it's just an effort you have to go through. The other exclusion path, we tried that in the past. We got, I think, a short-term some exclusions, but mostly failed. We looked at reclassifying our product. It's really unique because our product, in some cases, really fits with automotive, but in other cases, it's more kind of outdoor space, bike-related, or other categories. So it's kind of unique how each one is looked at and quite complicated. So we've had some pain in the past from importing some HTS code and anti-dumping issues of the past, I'll say. And I think just we talked about this earlier. I think really having either in-house or someone on the outside that you can go to for expertise is really important as you begin any of these activities, because it is complicated. And drawing upon that experience, it's tough to do it alone. I hope that answers part of the question.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, that's great, Ryan. Justin, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, Tom, maybe same question. What are you thinking about differently today versus, 8 years ago?
Yeah, we're an engineer to order sort of model, so it is challenging when you have customers kind of deciding and not a lot of parts that are common. I mean, they're some of the fungible stuff, the small stuff, but a navigation system or a radar or something like that. It's hard to get ahead of that because they're brand names. They're going to be purchased for a specific requirement, things like that. It's been a little challenging. I think on the aluminum side, conversations, we have a really good relationship with our vendor, our main supplier. They have taken positions on our behalf, really, and we're not paying for it. They look at they're anticipating our needs a little bit. That's going to give us some price stability as we move into 2025. Hopefully that continues into the back half. I think they've kind of given us indications that the first half is going to be okay. So yeah, I think, from a strategy, talking to suppliers as soon as we can, we reached out pretty quickly to our Canadian and Mexican, well, it's mostly Mexican assembly, but Canadian suppliers of some of our parts, try and get their take on what's happening. We really, again, it's tough to move some of our production or change vendors just because of the nature of what we build. But we also have done a repricing since 2018, 2017. We've done a repricing model, tried to build some escalations in some of the long-term contracts. We do have some multi-year contracts, building a series of boats over multiple years. Try and build in some escalations, things like that. Some success in that regard, but not always. A lot of these government contracts are, getting money from grants and things like that. So it's pretty fixed. They can't really do too much on their side. I think those are the main things that we've looked at, is that relationship with vendors is being very important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Maybe a question to both of you. One strategy that we had talked about with clients back when these tariffs were first implemented was working with lending partners to increase, working capital lines, try and load up on raw materials or inventory that might be subject to these higher rates. Is that something that either of you sort of employed at the time? And if so, do you think, increased interest rates in today's environment sort of increase the challenge of doing something similar?
Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, like I mentioned previously, we did increase our hold on finished goods at our DCs. It's tough though, because you're predicting once again what's going to sell, and we have whatever 2,000, 3,000 SKUs, and being able to predict on a finished good level. So it'd be much easier, if it was a sub-assembly or assembly or raw material for sure. We paid, I guess, painfully for a little bit of the pulling in too much of one category, not enough of another. Over the last couple of years, we also had the, kind of the COVID impact as well of too much inventory. Retailers had too much stock and kind of all came together. So it was a mess, but we will implore that again and do it a bit differently. I did see a question Q&A stream about a free trade zone. The Yakima, we don't utilize the free trade zone to defer tariff payments, so they don't happen all at once when you're importing and taking it into your own possession. It could be something, again, to look at from a cash flow perspective, but it's something that.
Yeah.
I think
the FTZ, I'll just jump in here just right now. The FTZ option is, when it comes to these special 301 tariffs or these steel and aluminum tariffs, that provides absolutely no advantage by executive order. There's special rules about, but when the goods come in, they're locked in at the rate applicable to them under these special tariff regimes, and it doesn't matter what you do with them afterwards. So one way or another, if the goods come into the United States out of the zone, you're paying the tariff based on how the condition when those goods originally went into the zone.
I was just going to add from Safeco's standpoint. Yeah, from Safeco's standpoint, I think the cost of funds is less of an issue for us than being able to store and predict, similar to what Ryan said, predict what products we need to take a position. We had a little bit of success during the supply chain meltdown with bringing in some outboard engines that were somewhat common across platforms. But again, because it's engineered to order, those customers are picking things and the combinations of things, and getting a forward look on that's pretty challenging.
Hey, Justin, there was a comment there, Eric question. It was about this Section 321 de minimis and goods coming from Mexico and a potential change that the Mexican government is imposing that would reduce its efficacy for U.S. companies. You want me to comment on that real fast?
Sure.
Yeah. So this de minimis ideas, and I had mentioned it earlier, you can inventory consumer goods and, well, quite frankly, any goods in Canada or Mexico, and when they come into the United States, as long as per each shipment consigned to one person or under $800 in value, they are totally exempt from all duties. And what the Mexican government did on December 19th is proposed to make a number of changes to their IMEX program, which would include these what's called maquiladoras. The biggest change that they propose is eliminating the use of this program for things falling in certain tariff chapters, which would eliminate it for all apparel and made-up textile articles. 2 days ago, the Mexican government issued another proclamation saying that change is on hold. For 60 days, or rather 6 months, they are not going to make any changes for the next 6 months under certain conditions, and it has only certain IMEX participants can continue to utilize this program. If you need more details, you can let me know, or I can direct you to somebody south of the border who can provide it. But it's remaining intact now for at least the next 6 months. Apparently, the change was made because there's a lot of folks down there that are non-compliant, so this was a way of trying to make sure that people are compliant.
Awesome, thank you. I think given an interest in time, let's sort of transition to some of the Q&A. I know we've already addressed a couple, but there's quite a number of questions rolling through there. So, Torre, if you've been checking those, let's get to one of those questions for the panel.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. And Erik, you just touched on it a little bit, but there's been a number of questions around retaliatory tariffs. We touched on Mexico. We've seen some noise from Canada as well as some other countries. Ryan and Tom, I'm curious what your thoughts are around that. How will that impact your businesses, and kind of, what are the expectations there? Ryan, if it's all right, maybe I'll start with you on that.
Yeah, Torre, was that specifically on 321 or?
Well, I think they're talking about retaliatory tariffs about, for example, if you're an export-driven company, which, Ryan, I'm assuming your stuff is not all sold in the United States.
Right.
If foreign countries start to impose equivalent tariffs on U.S. made goods, that's going to hurt U.S. companies that are looking to export, I think is the issue.
Yeah. For sure. We don't do a ton, honestly, of exporting. We do export our cargo boxes. Our U.S. is the biggest market for us. We also do quite a bit in Australia and then also in Europe. So the current tariff structure for those countries pulling out of Asia is limited to compare it to the U.S. But as we move production to Taiwan, actually, Australia has a larger tariff on Taiwan goods than they do China goods. So then it impacts the business in Australia, of course. So we are cognizant of that. When we move our cargo boxes across the world, they're large, they're full of air, and they're just not cost competitive. So those really are best produced closer to where they're being sold. We do some of that, but I can't comment too much on exporting from the U.S. Into other countries and what the impact there is.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Tom, how about you? I know you do a lot of military and municipality sales, but do you expect any change from or any impact from retaliatory tariffs on your business?
Yeah, my CEO and I talked a little bit about this in the last day or so. As we do have direct foreign sales. So Central and South America, we sold to Mexico. We were looking at the Asia Pacific market quite a bit. Definitely, if someone imposes these retaliatory, we can see our competitiveness evaporate because there are a lot of boat makers in other countries. So yeah, that would definitely have a potential downside for our direct foreign sales.
And Erik, how about you? I'd be curious just to hear your commentary on that and retaliatory tariffs. How quickly can those get imposed? I know that's probably a very difficult question to answer, but just any commentary on that.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the speed with which they get imposed, I mean, that's it depends if they're being done in sort of a unilateral fashion, the way the United States does it, or if other countries are going to go through the WTO process. I mean, there is a process where companies can bring complaints to this international group called the World Trade Organization, which the United States used to be a big supporter of. But that's a lengthy process, and eventually the WTO could make a decision that could authorize a country to impose tariffs on the United States. That's been going on with the Europeans for years over different issues. But I think if the U.S. unilaterally starts imposing tariffs on other countries, they may impose their own relatively quickly, unilaterally, and not go through this, international WTO process. So we should assume it will happen quickly, and it's going to be imposed on companies that are making stuff in the United States and exporting them, and that's who's going to get hurt by it.
Good. Erik, another audience question here. To what extent, if any, do you expect the Chinese government attempting to keep total U.S. landed costs close to consistent by subsidizing factories to effectively reduce the impact of the tariffs? Have you heard anything like that? Is that
more than they already do? So I will give you my my sort of anecdotal observations for the last 6 to 7 years. First of all, there are state-owned enterprises in China. Some of them are relatively large, but there's also a huge private sector in China, and they're not all getting handouts. There are some rebates, VAT rebates on exports. So whether or not that would go up to help ameliorate some of that, possibly. I know a lot of Chinese producers did cut prices significantly to help absorb some of the tariff increases, but still most of that's getting passed on to the U.S. importers. So, I mean, will the Chinese government do that? They may provide that type of assistance, but I also think that the Chinese government will impose retaliatory tariffs on U.S. products, just like they did before. And I think, it's bad for our agricultural sector, for sure. So, it's hard to say exactly what will happen. We're going to see. We'll find out in due course.
Yeah. How about you, Ryan? I'm curious if you've ever heard that, with your, with your China operations and China supplier base. Have you heard anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, we do receive the VAT in our China manufacturing. I think it's around 16%. I can't be certain in support. I think there's a comment, and it's very true too. I think the RMB would be calculated, and make some moves differently to support local manufacturing. The Chinese have a pretty large domestic consumption base now. And so, it's been 7 years, have times changed, but I think the growth in China is quite large. So they do have not as reliant on exports maybe as they were in the past. So that could influence their ability to do more or less. But I'm not hearing anything specifically. But once you do those items though, and you got to obviously have the appropriate transfer price study completed and go through all the mechanisms to follow through with that. But like Erik said, it remains to be seen. But I think there could be some, especially if it goes up to 60, it's quite a large jump.
And then maybe just a good question to end on here is, starting, maybe Tom, I'll start with you, is what advice do you have for other middle market companies in terms of navigating this new landscape around tariffs, and how should they be thinking about, mitigation strategies and, looking at their supply chain and everything?
Yeah, probably.
I know it's a very loaded question.
I was going to say fairly cliche too, my responses, unfortunately, but be creative, be flexible, get with your suppliers, see what you can do to get as much visibility going that direction. My CEO suggested also engaging with your congressional delegations. We worked with the groups here in Washington quite a bit. We've had some friends in that area, especially around the military side that we do. So that's been helpful for us in various situations. It could be helpful in this regard.
Yeah, I mimic that 100%. We've worked with some lobbyists and through some of our channels, the OIA or People for Bikes. It's helped us get some minimal exclusions from the 301s when they first came out. But it's a multifaceted approach. It's all about landed costs. So there's a lot of variables that come into play, and it's I would like to see more. If we're talking about, do we see any production come back to the U.S. the first run? I don't know anyone who moved production back to the U.S. based on the first 301 tariffs. Certainly, again, you could see that. We looked at changing the country of origin because we had already a facility. But I think seeing more policies, tax breaks, infrastructure, logistics support to really address the trade deficit. To level the playing field a little bit more than just tariffs. I would love to see some of that activity more than just passing the cost on to the consumer, because at the end of the day, that's where it goes, and it goes to the manufacturer and the consumers.
Yep, good advice. Erik, maybe I'll let you just mention to folks like what's a good place they can go for resources, or as companies are thinking about mitigation strategies and whatnot.
Well, a number of the things I've mentioned here, I no doubt Moss Adams can provide a lot of support, particularly tax implications and things of that nature, and in some process consulting. The U.S. Customs website has got a lot of resources. Just if you're looking for general issues, like there's a whole database of rulings that are on there. If you're kind of curious what rulings have come out on particular products for origin. The U.S. Trade Representative website has information on the current tariffs and things of that nature. Some of the things I talked about in terms of valuation. It gets pretty intricate, and and as Ryan had mentioned, trying to handle some of these issues on your own in a company, brings along with it some additional risk. Particularly, Ryan mentioned the AD/CVD issues, and that's terribly complicated stuff. We have a whole group in our firm that does those investigations, and they do them all day long, every day. And even I have to rely on them sometimes for some of this. They're out there. There's, customs and trade consultants. hopefully you get connected with folks that give you good information, and I think that's really it.
That's great, and really appreciate everybody's time. I think we're about right at time for the webinar. There was a ton of questions that were submitted that we weren't able to get to. We'll be following up with folks afterwards, and just thanks for a great discussion today, and have a good rest of your day, everybody.
All right. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks for the invite.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.